The alarm clock rang at 6 in the morning, its mechanical bell cutting through the darkness of a Moscow apartment where three families shared a single bathroom and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's breakfast conversation. Irina rose from the fold out couch that served as a bed at night and a seat during the day, careful not to wake her mother sleeping in the corner behind a curtain that created the illusion of privacy in a room that had none. She dressed quickly in the cold, the building's heat inconsistent, despite the promises that Soviet central planning had solved all problems of distribution and efficiency. This was daily life in the Soviet Union for 70 years, for three generations who were born, lived, and died under a system that promised to build heaven on earth, but delivered something far more complicated, far more human, far more contradictory than either its propagandists or its critics usually acknowledged. This was life in a place where education and healthcare were genuinely free and often excellent, but where speaking the wrong words at the wrong moment could destroy your family, where housing was guaranteed but might mean sharing 12 square meters with strangers, where unemployment did not exist, but neither did the freedom to choose your work or leave your city without permission. The Soviet Union has been reduced to caricature in Western memory, portrayed as either a totalitarian nightmare where everyone suffered constantly, or as a socialist paradise that Western capitalism destroyed through jealousy and sabotage. But 70 years of human experience cannot be flattened into propaganda from either side. The reality was more textured, more ordinary, more complicated than the extremes allow. People fell in love and raised children. They celebrated birthdays and mourned deaths. They found joy in small freedoms and developed strategies for navigating the gap between official ideology and lived reality. They believed and they doubted, often simultaneously, often in the same person. The cognitive dissonance that comes from living in a system that claims to have solved all contradictions while requiring you to ignore the contradictions you experience daily. Tonight, we enter the everyday world of Soviet citizens, not through the grand narratives of political history, but through the intimate details of ordinary life. The morning queue for bread, the afternoon at work where productivity mattered less than political reliability. The evening in the communal apartment where privacy was a luxury and trust was complicated by the knowledge that walls had ears and neighbors had incentives to report what they heard. We meet people who were not heroes or villains, but simply human beings trying to build lives within constraints they did not choose, finding meaning and connection despite a system designed to make individuals interchangeable, discovering forms of resistance so subtle they barely qualified as a resistance, but that preserved some core of autonomy in a world organized around collective submission. This is the Soviet Union as it was actually lived, day by day, year by year, generation by generation. Not the utopia, not the dystopia, just the place where millions of ordinary people woke up each morning and figured out how to make it through another day. Before we step into these Soviet mornings and evenings, these ordinary hours of extraordinary history, a gentle invitation. If these explorations of how people actually lived under systems that claim to transform human nature help you understand the gap between ideology and reality, between what governments promise and what citizens experience. Consider allowing this channel to become part of your evening reflections. A subscription, a like, these small gestures help others discover these examinations of daily life in places and times that are often reduced to political abstractions. And share with us in the comments below which other daily life experiences, which other ordinary hours in extraordinary circumstances you would like us to explore together. Now, let the present recede. We are about to enter apartments and factories, schools and stores, the intimate spaces where Soviet life actually happened, where ideology met breakfast and propaganda encountered the bread queue, where the gap between what was supposed to be and what actually was created the texture of daily existence for hundreds of millions of people across 7 decades. The alarm clock rang at 6 in the morning, a Soviet made Sevany that ticked loudly through the night and delivered a mechanical bell that could wake the entire corridor when it finally went off. Irina Mikhailovna reached from beneath her wool blanket, the only warm layer in a room where breath condensed into visible clouds on winter mornings, and silenced the clock before it could disturb her mother sleeping behind the curtain that divided their 12 square meters into zones of relative privacy. The darkness was complete. Moscow in January, seeing sunrise hours away, but the day's obligations did not wait for light. She dressed quickly, pulling on layers that had been warming under the blanket, stockings, and the slip and the brown dress she wore to her job at the textile factory. The sweater her mother had knitted from wool acquired through connections Irina preferred not to examine too closely. The room was cold enough that she could see her breath. The building's central heating was inconsistent despite the promises that Soviet planning had solved all problems of distribution. Some mornings, the radiators were too hot to touch. Other mornings, like this one, they barely took the edge off the January cold that seeped through walls that had been built quickly during the industrialization push of the 1930s, when speed mattered more than quality and construction standards were sacrificed to meet quotas that measured progress in units completed rather than lives made comfortable. The communalka, the communal apartment, had once been the home of a single family before the revolution. The building's architecture suggested pre-revolutionary bourgeois comfort, high ceilings and ornate molding that spoke of a time when this apartment had housed people with servants and space and privacy. But revolution had redistributed space as it had redistributed wealth, dividing large apartments into smaller units, assigning rooms to multiple families, creating living arrangements where what had been a dining room became someone's bedroom, where hallways were shared territory requiring negotiation and patience, where the single bathroom served four families and morning routines required coordination. That was part chess game, part diplomacy, part acceptance that privacy was a luxury Soviet citizens could not expect. Irina opened her door carefully, listening for sounds that would indicate whether the bathroom was occupied. The Petrov family, who had the room nearest the bathroom, had unofficial priority during the morning rush because their patriarch worked the early shift at the tram depot and needed to leave by 7. The Kuznetsovs, a young couple with an infant whose crying punctuated the night, usually waited until later. The Volkovs, an elderly couple who had lived in the apartment since before the revolution, when they had been servants in the very house that was now their prison of guaranteed housing, moved slowly and required extra time that other residents tried to accommodate out of respect for age and suffering that had earned consideration, if not actual ease. The hallway was narrow and poorly lit, a single bulb providing illumination that turned everyone's face yellow and sickly. The walls needed paint, had needed paint for years, but maintenance in Soviet housing was a matter of bureaucratic complexity that meant small repairs could take months, while large problems were addressed immediately because they threatened the building's structural integrity and therefore the plan's fulfillment. Irina had learned, as all Soviet citizens learn, to navigate the gap between what should happen according to planning logic and what actually happened according to the reality of resource allocation and bureaucratic incentive. The bathroom door was closed but not locked. Locking was forbidden in communal apartments, a rule designed to prevent someone from monopolizing shared space, but that created its own anxieties about privacy and interruption. Irina knocked softly, heard Pyotr Petrov's voice telling her he would be finished in 5 minutes. She waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall, feeling the cold through her dress, watching her breath condense in the dim light. This was normal. This was every morning. The waiting, the negotiation, the careful balance between asserting your needs and maintaining relationships with people you had not chosen to live with, but whose cooperation was essential to daily functioning. The door opened, and Pyotr emerged, nodding to her with the tired courtesy of people who had shared space for years without becoming friends, but who maintained civility because the alternative was intolerable. He was in his 50s, wearing the uniform of a tram driver, his face showing the lines of a man who rose at 5 every morning and worked until the muscles in his hands cramped from hours gripping controls. He did not smile because there was nothing to smile about at 6 in the morning in a freezing hallway waiting to use a bathroom that four families shared. But he was not unkind, and in a communalka, not unkind was as much as you could hope for from neighbors fate had imposed upon you. The bathroom itself was adequate by Soviet standards, which meant it functioned most of the time. And the hot water worked when the building's boiler was operating, which was usually but not always. The mirror was cracked, had been cracked for 3 years, the replacement a matter she had raised at the housing committee meeting, only to be told that mirrors were not priority items, and that Soviet citizens should be more concerned with building socialism than with vanity. She washed quickly in water that was lukewarm, brushed her teeth with the paste that came in metal tubes and tasted of mint and Soviet chemical industry, dried her face on the towel she had brought from her room because leaving personal items in shared spaces meant they would be used by others or disappear entirely. She returned to her room to find her mother awake, Klavdia Ivanovna, sitting on the edge of the bed where she had slept, her nightgown inadequate against the cold, her face showing the particular exhaustion of someone who had worked hard, her entire life, and whose reward was a corner of a shared room and a pension that bought less each year as prices rose in ways that official statistics did not acknowledge, because inflation was a capitalist problem that socialism had supposedly solved. Her mother had been a teacher before retirement, had educated a generation of Soviet children in mathematics and proper ideology, had believed genuinely in the revolution's promises when she was young, and had slowly, quietly become disillusioned as the promises remained unfulfilled year after year, decade after decade. They spoke in low voices, mindful that the Volkovs next door could hear, through walls that were thin enough to transmit conversation if you spoke at normal volume. Irina told her mother she would try to get bread on her way home from work, that the store near the factory sometimes received deliveries in the afternoon, and if she timed it right, she might avoid the queue. Her mother nodded, added that they needed soap, that she would check the store near the apartment, but expected it to be out as it usually was, that perhaps Irina could ask at her factory if anyone knew where soap might be available, because finding consumer goods required information networks that operated beneath official distribution systems. This was daily life's constant low level stress, the knowledge that obtaining basics required strategy and luck and connections, that you could have money but nothing to buy, that rubles accumulated in savings accounts because spending them required finding goods that were perpetually in deficit. The Soviet economy could build tanks and spacecraft, but struggled to produce toilet paper and light bulbs in sufficient quantities, a paradox that made sense only if you understood that the planning system prioritized heavy industry and military production while treating consumer goods as luxuries that could be sacrificed to more important goals. The kitchen was shared, like everything else in the communalka, equipped with four hot plates and a refrigerator that belonged nominally to the building but functionally to whoever could claim space inside it. Irina heated water for tea on the stove, careful not to use the burner that the Kuznetsovs claimed as theirs during morning hours. Part of the complex schedule that governed kitchen use, and that was respected not from legal obligation, but from the understanding that violating these unwritten rules meant conflict that made already difficult living situations unbearable. The tea was a concentrated brew that you diluted with hot water. The leaves were used multiple times before being discarded because new tea appeared irregularly in stores and had to be conserved. She drank it black, sugar being another item that required queuing and strategy to acquire, and spread a piece of black bread with butter that her mother had obtained through a friend whose daughter worked in a dairy. This network of exchange, of favors and connections, of knowing who had access to what, and owing them reciprocal help when they needed it. This was how Soviet citizens navigated the economy's failures, creating informal systems that made the formal system's dysfunctions survivable. Other residents emerged as the morning progressed, the ballet of shared living playing out in the hallway and kitchen, people acknowledging each other with nods and minimal conversation because speaking invited interaction that could lead to conflict or obligation, and most people wanted only to complete their morning routines and escape to work, where at least the performance of productivity was rewarded and the spaces were not quite so intimate and fraught. The Kuznetsov baby cried, its mother's exhausted voice trying to soothe it while making breakfast one handed. The father already gone to his job at the construction site where housing blocks identical to this one were being built to house the next generation of Soviet citizens, who would also learn to navigate shared spaces and diminished privacy and the gap between guaranteed housing and actual comfort. Irina gathered her things, the bag she carried to work, the ration card that had to be shown at the factory cafeteria, the party card that proved her membership and that had to be shown more often than she would have liked because political reliability was measured in part by whether you carried proof of it, whether you could demonstrate allegiance when demanded. She was not particularly political, had joined the party because advancement at the factory required it, because refusing to join marked you as unreliable in ways that affected not just your career but your access to better housing, to university placement for your children if you had them, to the thousand small benefits that made life marginally easier and that were denied to those who failed to demonstrate proper enthusiasm. She kissed her mother goodbye, stepped into the corridor one final time to use the bathroom before the long tram ride and factory shift, found it occupied again, and waited with the patience that Soviet life required, the acceptance that your time was not entirely your own, that schedules meant little when every simple task required navigation of others' needs and the system's inefficiencies. This was the texture of daily life, not the grand narratives of 5 year plans and space races and ideological triumph, but the ordinary friction of getting through a morning in a system that provided certain securities while extracting costs that could not be measured in rubles or quantified in planning documents. The street outside was dark and cold, snow piled along the edges where it had been shoveled from the sidewalks. The tram stop visible in the distance, a queue already forming of people waiting for transportation that would arrive eventually, maybe on schedule, maybe not. The reliability variable, but the price consistent. A few kopecks that even the poorest could afford, because public transportation was subsidized to near zero, one of the genuine achievements of the Soviet system that made mobility possible regardless of income. Irina joined the queue, stamping her feet against the cold, recognizing faces from the daily routine, workers and students and pensioners, the cross section of Soviet life moving toward another day of obligations and small survivals. No one spoke much. The cold, discouraging conversation and the hour too early for the energy that small talk required. But there was a solidarity in the shared waiting, the common understanding that everyone was enduring the same conditions, that the tram would come eventually and they would all crowd aboard, and the day would proceed according to patterns established over decades until they returned home to the communalka where the evening would bring its own negotiations and navigations. The tram arrived, its electric motor humming, its interior crowded even at this early hour, bodies pressed together in shared warmth that was the only warmth available until they reached their destinations. Irina found a handhold, braced herself against the movement, watched Moscow pass outside the windows, the monumental architecture of central boulevards giving way to the industrial zones where factories stood like fortresses, smoke rising from chimneys that signified production, employment, the economy functioning, even if the consumer goods it was supposed to produce, somehow never appeared in adequate quantities. She thought about the evening ahead, the return journey, the stop at the store that might or might not have bread, the communal dinner preparation in the shared kitchen where she and her mother would cook in the corner they had claimed while the Petrovs used their space and the Kuznetsovs managed their infant. And everyone maintained the careful distance that made cohabitation possible. She thought about the radio broadcast that would fill the apartment with news of production quotas exceeded and capitalist crisis and the superiority of the Soviet system, the endless loop of propaganda that everyone heard and few believed, but that could not be challenged because challenging meant identifying yourself as unreliable, as someone who did not properly appreciate the paradise that had been built through sacrifice and planning. But she also thought about small pleasures, the book she was reading that had been borrowed from a library that was free to all Soviet citizens, one of the genuine goods the system provided, access to culture and education that capitalist nations reserved for those who could pay. She thought about the possibility of visiting her aunt on Sunday, taking the train to the dacha plot where vegetables were grown to supplement the inadequate supplies from state stores, spending hours in a place where the air was cleaner and the pressures slightly less immediate. She thought about the rumors that color televisions might become available soon, that the waiting list was years long, but that eventually, possibly, she might obtain one through connections, patience, or some combination of both. This was daily life in the Soviet Union, neither the hell that Western propaganda portrayed, nor the paradise that Soviet propaganda claimed, but something more ordinary and more complicated, a life built around constraints and adaptations, around securities and controls, around the gap between what ideology promised and what reality delivered. People got up. They navigated shared spaces. They went to work. They returned home. They found meaning in relationships and small pleasures and the maintenance of dignity in circumstances that did not always honor it. They survived. And survival, in a system that claimed to have eliminated the struggle for survival, was itself a form of achievement, a testament to human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to preserve autonomy in spaces that claimed to have eliminated the need for it, for remaining individuals in a collective that insisted individuality was bourgeois deviation. The factory appeared ahead, its gates opening to receive the morning shift, its windows already lit with the harsh fluorescent light that would illuminate the next 8 hours of work that was guaranteed but not chosen, productive but not satisfying, necessary for the plan, but disconnected from any genuine sense of purpose, beyond meeting quotas and avoiding the attention of supervisors who measured enthusiasm more than output. Irina descended from the tram, joined the stream of workers entering the gates, left behind the morning's struggles in the communalka, but carried forward the understanding that evening would bring their own version of the same struggles, that tomorrow would be like today, that the system promised transformation but delivered repetition, that the revolution had come and gone and left in its wake an ordinary life that was extraordinary only in how thoroughly it had normalized what had once seemed impossible to accept. The morning ended as it had begun, with adaptation and endurance, with small navigations of large constraints, with the recognition that this was simply how things were, that complaining changed nothing, that the system would continue regardless of individual feelings about it, that survival meant accepting what could not be changed, while preserving what small spaces of autonomy remained, waiting for changes that might never come, or might come only when it was too late to enjoy them. The queue began forming before the store opened, a line of women and a few men standing in the October rain, their coats darkened by water that had been falling since dawn, their faces showing the particular patience that Soviet citizens had learned from decades of waiting. The understanding that obtaining basics required time as much as money, often more time than money because rubles were plentiful, but goods were not. No one knew exactly what the store would have that morning. The delivery schedules were irregular, the inventory unpredictable, but rumor had spread through the neighborhood that butter had arrived, possibly sausage, maybe even imported Hungarian canned goods that appeared in Moscow stores occasionally and disappeared within hours as word spread and the queues formed. Galina Petrovna had been standing in line for 40 minutes when the store finally opened, the metal gate rolling up to reveal shelves that were partially stocked, gaps visible where products should have been but were not. The deficit that was the defining feature of Soviet shopping, the constant shortage that made obtaining consumer goods less a transaction than a campaign, requiring strategy and luck, and the willingness to invest hours that could have been spent on anything else, but that had to be spent here because the alternative was going without. She entered with the practiced eye of someone who had been shopping in the Soviet system for 3 decades, scanning the shelves to assess what was actually available versus what the empty shelf space suggested had once been there. The butter was real, yellow blocks wrapped in wax paper, rationed to one per customer but available, which meant the morning had not been wasted entirely. The sausage was a different variety than usual, possibly lower quality, but meat was meat, and she would take what she could get. The canned goods were Hungarian stewed beef, expensive but shelf stable, and therefore valuable for the weeks when fresh meat was impossible to find. The queue inside was moving slowly, each transaction requiring the 3 step process that Soviet retail had perfected into absurdity. First, you identified what you wanted, and the clerk wrote out a slip with the price. Second, you took the slip to the cashier, who sat in a separate booth and paid, receiving a stamped receipt. Third, you returned to the original counter with the stamped receipt and collected your goods. The system was designed to prevent theft and ensure accurate accounting, but its effect was to make every purchase take 3 times as long as necessary, creating bottlenecks and frustration and the sense that the entire Soviet economy was organized around principles that had nothing to do with efficiency or customer service. Galina waited her turn, watching the woman ahead of her argue with the clerk about the price of cooking oil, insisting that it had been cheaper last week. The clerk responding with the weary indifference of someone who had no control over pricing and no interest in debating it. The argument resolved nothing, the woman paying the new price because the alternative was not buying oil, because in the Soviet economy you took what was available when it was available, or you went without, because waiting for prices to drop or for better options to appear meant potentially waiting forever. When Galina's turn came, she requested the maximum allowed quantities: 1 butter, 2 sausages, 3 cans of the Hungarian beef. The clerk wrote the slip without comment, her fingers moving mechanically through calculations she had performed thousands of times, her face showing no expression because expression required energy that state retail workers had learned to conserve for matters that actually affected them personally. Galina took the slip to the cashier, joined another queue, waited while the woman ahead counted out kopecks with arthritic hands, finally reached the window and paid, received her stamped receipt, return to the original counter for the third queue, the final wait before she could claim the goods she had already paid for. The entire process took nearly 2 hours from joining the initial queue outside to leaving with her purchases in the string bag that all Soviet citizens carried because plastic bags were unreliable luxuries, and planning ahead meant always having the means to transport whatever you might encounter. 2 hours to buy butter, sausage, and canned goods, a transaction that in the capitalist West would take minutes, but that in the Soviet system required the better part of a morning. The informal tax that shortages imposed on everyone who needed to eat. But the shopping was not finished. Galina needed bread, which meant a different store because Soviet retail was specialized in ways that made no sense to anyone except the planners who had designed the system. Bread stores sold bread, dairy stores sold milk and cheese, vegetable stores sold produce when produce was available, which in October meant potatoes and cabbage and onions, the root vegetables that stored well, but rarely the tomatoes or cucumbers that required greenhouses or imports that were allocated to higher priorities. Meat required yet another store when meat was available at all. The queues there the longest and the most desperate, because protein was the hardest deficit to solve, the gap that informal networks worked hardest to bridge. The bread store was a 10-minute walk, the queue outside shorter because bread appeared more reliably than other goods, the subsidized loaves that were the one constant in Soviet shopping, affordable enough that even pensioners on fixed incomes could buy it, the state's commitment to preventing hunger, even when it could not prevent shortage. Galina joined the line, recognized several women from the neighborhood, exchanged the minimal greetings that acknowledged shared experience without creating obligation for extended conversation. Everyone was tired. Everyone had been standing in queues since morning. No one had energy for pleasantries that served no practical purpose. Inside the store, the bread was dark and dense. The rye loaves that were staple of Russian diet, nutritious and feeling if not particularly exciting, the kind of bread that sustained you through long winters, but that you would not choose if lighter, whiter alternatives were available. Galina bought 2 loaves, enough for several days, tucked them into her bag alongside the butter and sausage and cans, felt the weight that represented success in the morning's hunt for goods, the small victory that made the hours of waiting seem almost worthwhile. Walking home, she passed other stores, looked in windows from habit, even when she needed nothing from them because you never knew what might appear unexpectedly, what delivery might have arrived that morning, what opportunity might be missed if you did not check. The shoe store was empty of customers because it was empty of shoes, the window displaying a single pair of boots that were either the wrong size for everyone in the neighborhood or had been there so long they had become decoration rather than merchandise. The clothing store had a queue, suggesting something desirable had arrived, but Galina had no time to investigate, would mention it to her sister, who might check tomorrow, the information flowing through informal networks that supplemented the official economy's failures. Home was the communalka she shared with 3 other families, the return from shopping meaning the beginning of the next phase of daily work. The preparation of food that would stretch the acquired goods across multiple meals, that would transform the butter and sausage and bread into sustenance for herself and her husband who worked at the power plant, and their daughter who was studying at the Polytechnic Institute. But before she could begin cooking, she had to navigate another economy, the second economy that operated alongside the official one, that made Soviet life possible when official channels failed. Her neighbor, Vera Alexandrovna, needed sugar. The official stores had been without it for 2 weeks. The shortage blamed variously on poor harvest, transportation problems, or the general dysfunction that characterized Soviet distribution. But Galina had connections. A cousin who worked at a bakery, who could occasionally divert small quantities for family and friends, operating in the gray zone between theft and informal redistribution that everyone participated in and no one acknowledged openly. She had acquired a kilogram last week, had more than she immediately needed, could trade some to Vera in exchange for the tea that Vera's husband brought back from business trips to Georgia. The informal barter that supplemented monetary exchange, that created networks of mutual obligation, that made the system's failures survivable. This was BLAT, the system of connections and favors that was essential to Soviet life, which meant having access to goods and services through personal networks rather than through official channels. It was not quite black market because money did not always change hands, not quite corruption because everyone participated, including party members and officials, not quite legal because it operated outside official distribution, but not quite illegal because the state tacitly accepted it as a necessary lubricant for an economy that would otherwise seize up entirely from friction between planning and reality. Galina's connections were modest compared to those of people with real power. She knew someone at the bakery, someone at the vegetable depot, someone whose sister worked at a store that sometimes received Western cosmetics. These connections got her sugar and occasional access to fresh vegetables, and once, memorably, a tube of French lipstick that she wore on special occasions and that made her feel, briefly, connected to a world beyond Soviet shortage and substitution. But she also knew people with better connections, the wife of a factory director who could obtain items that never appeared in regular stores, the nephew of a party official who had access to special shops where the privileged bought Western goods at Soviet prices, the hierarchies of access that made Soviet society unequal despite the ideology of equality. The second economy extended beyond personal favors into outright black markets, where goods were bought and sold for profit, where Western genes acquired through tourism or theft commanded prices that were multiples of official wages, where records by banned Western musicians circulated on homemade recordings, and where currency speculation existed despite being a criminal offense punishable by years in labor camps. Galina participated in this economy cautiously, buying occasionally from people who sold from apartments or parks or through word of mouth networks, understanding that the risks were real, but that the alternatives meant going without items that made life marginally more comfortable or children marginally happier. Her daughter wanted Western music, the rock bands that were officially condemned but universally desired, the cultural products that represented freedom and rebellion and connection to a world that Soviet ideology taught was decadent and exploitative, but that young people saw as exciting and authentic in ways that Soviet culture was not. Galina had paid 20 rubles, nearly a week's wages, for a Beatles record that had been pressed onto old X ray film. The ghostly images of bones visible beneath the grooves, the ingenuity of the underground economy, transforming medical waste into cultural contraband. Her daughter played it quietly, headphones connected to the record player that had been a wedding gift to Galina decades before. The Western music, a secret pleasure that violated no law explicitly but that created the sense of participating in something forbidden and therefore meaningful. The economic dysfunction created cynicism that ate away at the system's legitimacy more effectively than any dissident literature. When the propaganda claimed that Soviet planning was superior to capitalist chaos, people thought about the hours spent queuing for butter. When the television praised production increases, people noticed that the increases were in heavy industrial goods, which they never saw, while consumer items remained perpetually scarce. When the party promised a better tomorrow, people remembered that similar promises had been made for decades while daily life remained defined by shortage and substitution, and the need to spend entire mornings hunting for basics that should have been simple to acquire. But there were also genuine securities that the system provided, contexts that made the shortages seem less catastrophic than they might otherwise have been. Housing was guaranteed, inadequate, but reliable. Health care was free, uneven in quality, but universally accessible. Education opened doors regardless of parents' income. Employment was assured, alienating but dependable. These securities meant that Soviet citizens could focus their economic anxiety on consumption rather than on survival, could complain about shortages while knowing they would not starve or become homeless, and that the system's failures were frustrating rather than catastrophic for most people most of the time. Galina prepared dinner in the shared kitchen. The butter she had queued for used to fry potatoes, the sausage sliced and added for protein and flavor, and the bread served alongside in slices thick enough to be filling. Her husband came home from the power plant, tired but not exhausted, his work providing stability if not satisfaction, his wage adequate for Soviet life, if not for the luxuries that advertising in Western magazines suggested were normal in capitalist countries. Their daughter arrived from the institute, books heavy in her bag, her mind full of engineering knowledge that the Soviet system did teach well, the technical education that was genuinely world class, even if the consumer economy that might have employed that knowledge productively was dysfunctional. They ate together in the small space that was theirs, listening to the radio broadcast that filled apartments across the Soviet Union with news of production quotas exceeded and capitalist crisis and the superiority of their system, the words washing over them without penetrating deeply, because everyone had learned to hear them without believing them, to maintain the public performance of acceptance while preserving private knowledge that the propaganda bore little relation to lived experience. This cognitive dissonance was the texture of Soviet life, the gap between what you were supposed to believe and what you actually experienced, between the paradise that ideology described and the ordinary struggles that filled your days. After dinner, Galina calculated their finances, the rubles that accumulated, because spending them required finding goods that were often unavailable, the savings account that grew not from frugality, but from inability to purchase what you want, even when you had money to pay for it. This was the paradox of the Soviet economy: money without goods, demand without supply. planning that could mobilize millions for industrial projects, but that could not stock stores with the simple items that made daily life comfortable. The absurdity was so total it became normal, the baseline against which Soviet citizens measured their expectations, the dysfunction they learned to navigate rather than resist, because resistance changed nothing, and adaptation at least made survival possible. As evening deepened, and the apartment settled into its nightly rhythms, the sounds of other families preparing for sleep, bleeding through thin walls, Galena reflected on the day's small victories and frustrations. She had obtained butter and sausage. She had helped a neighbor and strengthened a connection that might be useful later. She had provided for her family within the constraints the system imposed. These achievements were modest but real, the ordinary heroism of people who made life work despite rather than because of the economy they inhabited. Tomorrow would bring new queues, new shortages, and new negotiations through informal networks. The store might have milk or might not. The bakery might have sugar available, or the connection might have run dry. The daughter might need something for her studies that would require a day of searching through specialist stores that rarely had what their signs advertised. But tomorrow would also bring the same securities, the same guarantees, the same knowledge that whatever shortages existed, the fundamentals were provided, that the system was dysfunctional but not collapsing, that life would continue in its frustrating, grinding, ordinary way. The lights went out across Moscow, the city settling into darkness, punctuated by the glow of street lamps and the occasional lit window where someone was reading or working late. And in thousands of apartments, Soviet citizens performed the same calculations Galena had performed, measuring what they had acquired against what they needed, planning tomorrow's strategies for navigating an economy that promised abundance but delivered scarcity, that claimed to serve the people. But that required the people to serve it, spending their time, energy, and ingenuity on obtaining basics that should have been simple to acquire, but that had become the consuming labor of daily life. The queue would form again tomorrow. The store would open with uncertain inventory. The second economy would supplement the first, and Soviet citizens would adapt and endure and preserve what dignity they could in a system that claimed to honor the worker while making work of the simple act of shopping, while transforming the acquisition of butter into a morning's campaign, while creating conditions where survival required constant navigation of dysfunction that ideology insisted did not exist. This was daily economic life in the Soviet Union. Neither the efficiency that propaganda claimed nor the total collapse that never quite arrived, but something in between. Ordinary people finding extraordinary ways to make an extraordinary system produce ordinary results, getting through another day in the only economy they knew, waiting in queues that seemed to lead nowhere, but that eventually, usually, produced the goods that made another day possible. The factory gates opened at 7:45 each morning, releasing a flood of workers who had traveled from across Moscow on overcrowded trams and metro trains, converging on the manufacturing complex that stretched across several city blocks like a small fortified city within the larger one. Viktor Sergeyevich joined the stream of bodies moving toward the main building, his lunch pail in one hand and his work permit in the other, ready to show the guard who checked documents with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times and who no longer saw faces, only papers that either matched the approved list or did not. The Krasny Oktyabr machine tool factory had been operating since the 1930s. Built during the first 5 year plan when Stalin's industrialization drive transformed the Soviet Union from agrarian backwater into industrial power through methods that prioritized speed over everything else, including the comfort and sometimes the lives of the workers who made the transformation possible. The building itself showed its age and origins, concrete that was already crumbling despite being only 30 years old, windows that fit poorly in their frames, floors that were uneven enough to create standing water when the cleaning crews mopped, and the physical deterioration that characterized Soviet infrastructure built quickly and maintained inadequately. Victor's shift began at 8, marked not by a whistle like in old factories, but by a buzzer that was supposed to sound modern and efficient, but that mostly sounded harsh and unpleasant. The electronic tone cutting through the ambient noise of machinery that had already been running for hours. Because the factory operated multiple shifts, the production continuing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the relentless output that the plan demanded and that the workers provided not from enthusiasm, but from the understanding that their jobs depended on meeting quotas that were set in Moscow by planners who had never visited the factory floor and who had no understanding of what the quotas actually required. He punched his time card, the mechanical stamp recording his arrival to the minute, creating the documentation that would be used to calculate his wages and to verify that he had worked the hours required by his employment contract. Timekeeping was one of the few aspects of Soviet labor that was genuinely rigorous, the state caring deeply about tracking time, even when it cared less about what was actually accomplished during that time, the form mattering more than the substance in ways that characterized the entire system. The workshop where Victor spent his days was large and loud, filled with lathes and milling machines and the sharp smell of cutting oil and metal shavings. The industrial landscape that had replaced the agricultural landscape his grandfather had known, the transformation of Russian labor from rural to urban, from seasonal to mechanized, from the rhythms of nature to the rhythms of production schedules set by distant bureaucrats. His station was near the middle of the floor, a lathe where he shaped metal parts according to specifications that came down from the engineering department, the technical drawings that showed precise measurements, but that often contained errors or contradicted previous drawings, or called for materials that were not available, requiring improvisation that was simultaneously necessary for production to continue and technically forbidden because deviation from specifications violated the plan. The morning's work assignment was connecting rods for agricultural machinery, parts that would be shipped to factories that assembled tractors, which would eventually, the morning's work, end up in collective farms where they would break down because Soviet agricultural equipment was notoriously unreliable, designed to meet production quotas rather than to function effectively in the field. Victor knew this, as all the workers knew this, the fundamental dysfunction where the plan measured success in units produced rather than in the utility of what was produced, creating incentives to maximize quantity while ignoring quality. To meet targets, even when meeting them meant producing goods that would fail immediately upon use. But quality control was someone else's responsibility, not his. And besides, The inspectors who were supposed to catch defects were themselves evaluated on how many parts they approved rather than on how many they rejected, creating a system where everyone had incentives to pass substandard work forward rather than to slow production by insisting on standards that would make meeting quotas impossible. Victor machined the parts to roughly the correct dimensions, close enough that they would pass inspection, not so close that he wasted time on precision that no one would reward, and that might actually harm him by reducing his output numbers. The work was neither difficult nor interesting. The kind of labor that could be performed almost automatically once you had learned the basic skills, the repetition that allowed the mind to wander while the hands continued their mechanical dance with metal and machine. Victor thought about many things while working, about his wife at home in the communalka, about his son who was struggling in school because he had inherited his father's practical intelligence but not the academic aptitude that the Soviet education system valued, about the rumor that color televisions might become available through the factory store that sold goods to workers at subsidized prices, about the ache in his lower back that had been there for years and that would probably be there until he retired or died, whichever came first. The morning shift was interrupted at 10 by the brigade leader, Konstantin Ilyich, who called the workers to gather for the daily production meeting. These meetings were mandatory, brief assemblies where the previous day's output was announced, where the brigade's performance was compared to other brigades in the factory, where workers who had exceeded norms were praised, and those who had fallen short were encouraged to work harder. The meetings were supposed to inspire socialist competition, to create friendly rivalry that would increase productivity, but mostly they created resentment because the comparisons were often unfair. Some brigades receiving newer equipment or better materials while others made do with machines that broke down constantly and materials that were substandard. Konstantin read from a sheet that had been prepared by the factory party committee, praising Brigade 7 for exceeding their monthly quota by 15%, noting that Victor's Brigade 3 was only at 97% with 5 days remaining in the month, suggesting that everyone needed to increase their effort and show more socialist consciousness in their work. The implicit threat was clear. Failing to meet quotas could result in reduced bonuses or lost privileges or being marked as politically unreliable. The gentle pressure that the system applied to ensure compliance without requiring overt coercion. Victor listened with the expression of attentiveness that he had perfected over years of similar meetings, his face showing engagement while his mind calculated whether the 97% figure was accurate or inflated, whether Brigade 7 had actually exceeded their quota or had simply reported numbers that the party committee wanted to hear. The Soviet workplace operated on two sets of books: the official numbers that were reported upward to satisfy planning requirements, and the actual numbers that workers knew bore little relation to the official ones. Systematic lying was necessary to make the system function because honest reporting would reveal that the quotas were unrealistic and the plan was failing. After the meeting, work resumed with slightly increased intensity, not because anyone believed the exhortations to socialist consciousness, but because everyone understood that falling too far behind created problems that were easier to avoid than to solve. Victor increased his pace marginally, sacrificing even the minimal quality he had been maintaining, producing parts that met the dimensional requirements barely, that would pass inspection because the inspectors had the same incentives he did, that would be counted toward the quota and shipped to the tractor factory, where they would eventually fail and be replaced with parts that would also fail. The cycle of dysfunction perpetuating itself because the system measured success in production rather than in use. The lunch break came at noon, 30 minutes that were supposed to provide rest, but that were barely long enough to eat the food workers had brought from home and to smoke the cigarettes that were one of the few reliable consumer goods the Soviet economy produced, possibly because tobacco was prioritized for the same reason vodka was, because they pacified the population and generated revenue that supported the state. Victor joined his fellow workers in the canteen, a large room with tables and benches that were adequate but not comfortable, eating the sandwiches his wife had made and drinking the tea that was provided by the factory, listening to conversations that ranged from complaints about work to speculation about football results to careful discussion of news that had filtered through informal channels about events the official media reported differently or not at all. Politics was discussed cautiously, even among workers who had known each other for years. The understanding that saying the wrong thing in the wrong company could create problems, that informants existed not from malice necessarily, but from the rewards that reporting unreliable talk could bring, the promotions and privileges that were allocated based on political reliability as much as on competence. Victor mostly listened, contributing only safe observations about production quotas and factory management, avoiding anything that could be interpreted as criticism of the party or the system or the leadership, maintaining the public face that allowed him to preserve his private thoughts. The afternoon brought the party meeting, the weekly assembly that all workers were required to attend regardless of whether they were party members. The political education that was supposed to reinforce ideological commitment, but that mostly reinforced cynicism about ideology itself. The meeting was held in the same canteen where they had eaten lunch, the tables cleared and chairs arranged in rows facing the front, where the factory party secretary stood, with notes prepared by someone higher in the hierarchy. The cascade of propaganda flowing down from central committee, through regional offices, through factory committees to the workers themselves, each level adding its own interpretation and removing whatever inconvenient truths might have started at the top. The party secretary, Dmitry Vassilievich, was a man in his 50s who had worked at the factory for decades and had risen through party ranks, not through exceptional ability, but through exceptional reliability, through his willingness to repeat whatever the current line was and to denounce whatever the current enemy was, through the political instinct that told him when to be enthusiastic and when to be cautious, when to show initiative and when to wait for direction. He began the meeting with praise for Soviet achievements, the latest production statistics that showed growth in heavy industry, the space program's successes that demonstrated technological superiority, and the condemnation of American imperialism in Vietnam that showed moral superiority. Victor listened with the practiced disengagement of someone who had heard variations of the same speech for years, the words washing over him without penetrating deeply because they bore so little relation to his experience that they seemed to describe a different country entirely, not the Soviet Union where he waited in queues for butter, but some idealized version where abundance and efficiency were real rather than aspirational. But he maintained the appearance of attention because anything else was dangerous. Because being seen not paying attention during political education could mark you as unreliable, could affect your advancement, or your access to the privileges that made Soviet life bearable. The meeting included self criticism, the ritualized confessions where workers stood and acknowledged their failures to meet production targets, or to show sufficient socialist consciousness, or to properly understand party directives, the performance of repentance that was supposed to demonstrate ideological commitment, but that everyone understood was theater, words spoken because they had to be spoken, acknowledgement of deviation before the deviation was formally noted and punished. Victor had learned to phrase his self criticisms carefully, admitting minor failings while attributing them to understandable causes, showing humility without appearing incompetent, demonstrating proper attitude while avoiding the appearance of excessive enthusiasm that might invite scrutiny. One worker, a young man named Alexei who was relatively new to the factory, made the mistake of actual honesty during his self criticism, noting that he had struggled to meet his quota because his machine kept breaking down and maintenance had been slow to respond. The party secretary's face hardened slightly, noting for the record that Alexei seemed to be blaming others for his own failures, that socialist consciousness meant taking responsibility rather than making excuses, and that perhaps Alexei needed additional political education to understand his role in the collective enterprise. The younger man reddened, mumbled an apology, sat down in obvious distress, while the other workers avoided looking at him, uncomfortable with witnessing the public humiliation, but unwilling to defend him because defense would mark them as sharing his unreliability. The meeting ended with singing, the Internationale and the Soviet anthem, the workers standing and moving their mouths in approximation of the lyrics, the sound filling the canteen but carrying no conviction, the performance that satisfied the requirement without pretending to emotional authenticity. Victor sang because everyone sang, because not singing was too conspicuous, because small conformities were the price of preserving larger autonomies, the trade off that Soviet citizens made constantly, giving the system what it demanded publicly while protecting what they valued privately. The afternoon shift continued until 5, the final hours the longest because fatigue had accumulated, and the end of the workday seemed to recede as the clock moved slowly toward quitting time. Victor's production slowed despite his earlier increase, his body and mind both exhausted from the combination of physical labor and political performance, from the need to work while also appearing to work with proper socialist enthusiasm, from the constant calculation of how much effort was necessary to avoid problems, while not so much that it exhausted him completely. The buzzer sounded at 5, releasing the day shift to be replaced by the evening shift, the factory continuing its production as Victor and his fellow workers filed out through gates that had been closed all day, the control that prevented workers from leaving early or from taking breaks not authorized by the schedule. He punched his time card again, documenting the completion of another day, adding to the accumulation of days that would eventually result in pension and retirement and the possibility of rest. Though retirement under Soviet conditions meant reduced income and the same communal apartment and the same shortages, just with more time to stand in queues and less money to spend when you finally reached the front. Walking toward the tram stop, Victor felt the particular exhaustion that came not just from physical labor, but from the constant performance that Soviet work required, the need to maintain the appearance of belief in a system that everyone knew was dysfunctional, to pretend that quotas mattered when everyone knew quality was being sacrificed to meet them, to participate in political meetings that addressed nothing real while ignoring problems that were obvious to anyone on the factory floor. The cognitive dissonance was wearing in ways that pure physical labor was not. The mental energy required to maintain the split between public performance and private knowledge, between what you said and what you thought, between the propaganda's claims and your daily experience. But he also felt a security that capitalism did not provide, the knowledge that tomorrow he would return to the same job, that his employment was guaranteed regardless of his productivity, that the factory could not fire him for being slow or unenthusiastic, that the social contract between Soviet state and Soviet worker included protection from unemployment even if it did not include much else. This security was real, meaningful, the foundation that allowed Soviet citizens to criticize the system's failures while accepting its continuation, knowing that whatever dysfunction existed, the basics were guaranteed in ways that capitalist systems did not guarantee. The tram arrived, crowded with workers from various factories and offices, all heading home to communalkas and small apartments, to families and dinners and the evening hours that belonged to them rather than to the state, the private time that made the public performance bearable. Victor found a space near the door, watched Moscow pass outside the window, the city in evening light looking almost beautiful despite the gray monotony of its architecture, the human activity giving life to spaces that were designed without much consideration for beauty or comfort. Tomorrow would be the same. The factory gates would open, the machines would run, the quotas would be pursued with the minimal effort necessary to avoid trouble. The party meetings would repeat the same propaganda, and Victor would perform his roles, worker and citizen and party member, maintaining the appearance of commitment while preserving the inner distance that allowed him to remain himself in a system designed to make everyone interchangeable, to subordinate individual to collective, to replace personal judgment with party discipline. But tonight he could rest. He could eat dinner with his family. He could listen to the radio or read a book or simply sit in silence, letting the day's performance fall away, returning briefly to himself before tomorrow required him to put the performance back on. And this oscillation between public conformity and private authenticity was the rhythm of Soviet life, the daily negotiation of how to survive in a system that claimed total loyalty while inspiring mostly exhaustion, that promised transformation while delivering repetition, that measured success in quotas met, but that could not quantify what was lost in the meeting of them. The factory lights remained on behind him, the evening shift beginning its work, the production continuing without pause, the Soviet economy grinding forward through the labor of millions who showed up and performed their roles and went home and returned the next day, not from belief but from necessity, not from enthusiasm but from acceptance, building socialism one quota at a time, while wondering if what they were building bore any relation to the paradise that had been promised, or whether they were simply going through motions that would continue until the system finally exhausted itself and everyone could stop pretending that the performance was anything more than survival disguised as commitment. The red neckerchief was folded into a triangle and tied around Masha's neck on the morning of her initiation into the Young Pioneers, the ceremony that marked her transition from ordinary child to junior member of the Soviet collective, from someone who simply lived under communism to someone who would actively build it. She was 9 years old, standing in formation with her classmates in the school auditorium, reciting the pledge that she had memorized over the previous weeks, promising to love her motherland, to live and study as Lenin taught, to prepare herself to defend her country, to be honest and truthful, and a good comrade. The pledge was sincere when she spoke it, not because Masha understood its full political implications, but because at 9 years old she genuinely wanted to belong, to be part of something larger than herself, to wear the symbol that marked her as one of the collective rather than outside it. The ceremony was designed to appeal to these universal childhood desires for acceptance and significance, wrapping political indoctrination in the emotional language of belonging and achievement, making ideology feel like a natural extension of wanting to be good, to be valued, to be recognized as worthy by the adults whose approval children instinctively sought. Her parents sat in the audience, applauding with the other parents as the entire third grade was inducted simultaneously, their faces showing the complex mixture of emotions that Soviet parents learned to manage: pride in their children's achievement mixed with discomfort at the political content, happiness at seeing their daughter included mixed with awareness of what inclusion required, what thoughts would have to be performed publicly, even if they were doubted privately. Her father, Nikolai, was an engineer who believed in communism's technological promises but doubted its political methods. Her mother, Svetlana, had grown up under Stalin and remembered when political education had been enforced with terror rather than gentle pressure, when deviation meant not just social consequences but physical danger, when children had been encouraged to denounce their parents, and some had actually done so. But this was 1975, the Brezhnev era, when the terror had subsided into stagnation, when the system had settled into a kind of exhausted stability, where ideology was still taught but with less conviction, where rituals were performed but with decreasing belief, where the forms persisted while the substance slowly drained away. Masha's induction into the pioneers was real in its ceremonial aspects, but hollow in its ideological ones, a performance that everyone participated in because participation was expected and refusal was too costly, but that few believed would actually transform children into the new Soviet people that the rhetoric described. School had been political from the beginning, From the first day when Masha had learned not just her letters, but also that Lenin had loved children and that the Soviet Union was the most advanced country in the world. The best place to grow up because Soviet children had free education and healthcare and would never know the exploitation that capitalist children suffered under systems that valued profit over people. The lessons continued through the years, woven into every subject, history transformed into heroic narratives of revolutionary struggle and fascist defeat, literature selected to teach proper values and political consciousness, mathematics, word problems involving tractor production and collective farm yields, the complete integration of education and ideology that made separating learning from indoctrination impossible. But children learned quickly to navigate the gap between school knowledge and home knowledge, to understand that some things were said at school and other things were said at home, and the two versions did not always align. Masha knew from school that the Soviet Union was paradise and that life under capitalism was miserable, that workers in the West were oppressed and envied Soviet workers their security and equality. But she knew from her grandmother's careful comments that before the revolution her family had been relatively comfortable, that the civil war and collectivization had destroyed that comfort, that not everything the state claimed was accurate and not everything it condemned was wrong. This double consciousness developed early. The awareness that truth was complicated and that speaking all of your thoughts was dangerous, that some observations had to remain private even when they seemed obvious, that the gap between official narrative and lived experience had to be navigated carefully to avoid creating problems for yourself and your family. By the time Masha was inducted into the pioneers, she already understood intuitively that there were things you believed and things you performed believing, that sincerity and strategy were not always compatible, that surviving meant learning when to speak and when to remain silent. The pioneer meetings happened twice a week after school, gatherings in the classroom where the brigade leader, usually an older student from the Komsomol, led them in activities that mixed genuine childhood fun with political education. They played games that taught cooperation and collective achievement. They sang songs about Lenin and the party and the motherland. They learned about Soviet heroes, the cosmonauts and the war veterans and the shock workers who exceeded production quotas, the models they were supposed to emulate, the examples of what Soviet children could become if they properly internalized the lessons they were being taught. Some of it Masha enjoyed. The sense of belonging, of being part of a group with shared identity and purpose, appealed to something fundamental in childhood psychology. The camping trips and sports competitions, the emphasis on physical fitness and outdoor activity, provided experiences that were meaningful regardless of their ideological packaging. The community service projects, helping elderly neighbors or planting trees, taught values that were admirable even if they were presented as specifically Soviet rather than universal human virtues. But she also felt the pressure, the constant evaluation of enthusiasm and conformity, the awareness that being a good pioneer meant more than just attending meetings and wearing your neckerchief. It meant demonstrating proper political consciousness, volunteering to lead activities, criticizing those who showed insufficient commitment, and becoming enforcers of the ideology among your peers. Masha was not naturally confrontational, did not enjoy the dynamic where children policed each other's political reliability, where friendship could become complicated by the expectation that you would report deviations, that loyalty to the collective should supersede loyalty to individuals. At home, her parents taught her different lessons, carefully, in conversations that happened behind closed doors where neighbors could not overhear. They taught her to be skeptical without being cynical, to understand that propaganda contained distortions without rejecting everything the system claimed, to maintain critical thinking while performing the conformity that school and pioneers required. Her father showed her how to identify logical inconsistencies in official narratives, how to notice when statistics were manipulated or when historical events were presented selectively. Her mother taught her the value of privacy, of maintaining inner spaces that ideology could not reach, of protecting thoughts and feelings that were yours alone and did not have to be shared or subjected to collective judgment. These home lessons created tension with school lessons, forcing Masha to constantly evaluate which version to trust, which authorities to believe when they contradicted each other. The tension was uncomfortable but also educational, teaching her that truth was often more complex than any single narrative allowed, that adults she trusted could disagree about fundamental things, that certainty was often performance and doubt was a reasonable response to conflicting information. This epistemological complexity was unusual for a child her age, a forced maturity that came from growing up in a system where the official story and the lived reality often diverged in ways that even children could detect. The school curriculum became increasingly political as she grew older, with history classes spending more time on the Great Patriotic War and the building of socialism than on earlier periods, literature focusing on socialist realism that praised workers and collective farms while excluding works that explored ambiguity or individual psychological complexity. Science taught with materialist dialectics that were supposed to explain not just physical phenomena but historical development and social organization. The education was simultaneously excellent in technical subjects and impoverished in areas where ideology constrained inquiry, creating students who could excel in mathematics and engineering while knowing little accurate history and less philosophy, who could design bridges but could not question why the bridges were being built where they were or whose interests they served. Masha was a good student, not brilliant but conscientious, someone who learned what she was taught and performed well on examinations that measured mastery of approved material. But she also learned to recognize what was not being taught, to notice the gaps in the curriculum, to understand that certain questions were not asked because the answers would be inconvenient, that certain topics were avoided because exploring them honestly would reveal contradictions in the official narrative. This negative knowledge, the awareness of what was absent, became its own form of education, teaching her about the system's limitations and anxieties, about what it feared enough to suppress. The transition from young pioneers to Komsomol came at age 14. Another ceremony, another pledge, more responsibilities, and more political education, the training ground for future party membership for those who wanted or needed it for career advancement. By this age, the performances had become more sophisticated, the understanding of what was required more cynical, the gap between genuine belief and strategic conformity wider and more conscious. Some of Masha's classmates were true believers, children who had internalized the ideology completely, who saw no contradiction between propaganda and reality because they had been successfully socialized to accept the official narrative without question, for whom Soviet identity was not performance but genuine self understanding. Others were already deeply cynical, especially those whose parents were dissidents or who had connections to the West through relatives who had emigrated, who had access to samizdat literature or forbidden music, who understood that the world beyond Soviet borders was more complex than the caricature presented in political education classes. These students performed their roles with visible irony, saying the right words but with inflections that suggested distance, participating in required activities with minimal enthusiasm, making it clear to those who could read the signals that compliance was strategic rather than sincere. Masha fell between these extremes, neither true believer nor open cynic, someone who had absorbed enough ideology to see its appeal while retaining enough critical distance to recognize its problems, who wanted to believe in the system's promises while confronting daily evidence that the promises remained unfulfilled, who performed her role adequately while preserving doubt that would have been dangerous to express openly. This middle position was perhaps the most common among Soviet youth in the Brezhnev era, the position of people who were not invested enough to be zealots, but not alienated enough to risk open resistance, who simply wanted to navigate the system with minimal friction while preserving some autonomy of thought and feeling. The pressure to join the party would come later, in university or early career, the final step in the progression from pioneer to komsomol to full party membership that marked the path of proper Soviet development. Masha's parents warned her about this, explained that party membership would be presented as voluntary, but that refusing would limit her career options, that joining would require compromises she might later regret, that the decision would define how much of herself she would have to sacrifice to achieve the material security and social position that the system offered to those who demonstrated proper political reliability. But at 14, these future choices seemed distant. The present concern was managing the immediate pressures of school and komsomol, of maintaining the performance while preserving the private self, of being a good enough Soviet citizen to avoid problems while resisting the complete absorption that the system desired. Masha developed strategies that many Soviet children developed, the careful calibration of how much enthusiasm to show, how to volunteer for visible but low commitment activities that demonstrated participation without consuming too much time or energy, and how to praise the system in technically correct ways but emotionally hollow, how to protect her inner life while surrendering enough of her outer life to satisfy requirements. She also found small spaces of resistance that were too subtle to be punished, the Western music listened to on headphones, the fashion choices that pushed against but did not quite violate official norms, the conversations with trusted friends where they could speak more honestly about their frustrations and doubts, where they could admit that the reality they experienced did not match the paradise that propaganda described. These small freedoms were precious precisely because they were small. They could be protected and preserved because they created islands of autonomy in a sea of collective demands. Her grandmother became an important figure in these years, someone who remembered the revolution and the civil war and Stalin's terror, who had seen the system at its most brutal and at its most hopeful, who could provide a historical perspective that contextualized the present's frustrations. The grandmother spoke carefully, aware that children could repeat things innocently that would create problems for the family. But she also conveyed through stories and careful comments that the Soviet Union had never been the paradise it claimed, that every promise had been accompanied by costs that were rarely acknowledged, that the future had been perpetually deferred while the present required endless sacrifice. These conversations taught Masha that the system had a history, that the Brezhnev era stagnation she was experiencing was itself a product of choices and conflicts that went back decades, that the contradictions she noticed were not new but were structural features that had persisted despite claims that socialism was scientific and would solve all human problems. This historical consciousness made her present experience make more sense, contextualizing her frustrations as part of a longer pattern rather than as isolated failures that better leadership might fix. By the time Masha reached her late teens, she had developed the full repertoire of skills that Soviet children learned, the double consciousness that allowed her to function successfully in official institutions while maintaining private thoughts and values, the performance skills that let her demonstrate appropriate enthusiasm without experiencing it, the social intelligence that told her who could be trusted with honest conversation and who required only the official script, the resignation that accepted the system as unchangeable while refusing to let it define her entirely. She was neither damaged by her upbringing nor triumphant over it, neither broken by the pressures nor liberated by resistance. She was simply a product of the system, someone who had learned to navigate its contradictions and constraints, who had preserved enough of herself to remain recognizably individual while conforming enough to avoid the costs of visible nonconformity. This was the ordinary achievement of Soviet childhood, not heroic but not insignificant, the creation of selves that could function in a system designed to suppress selfhood, that could maintain autonomy within structures built to eliminate it. As she prepared to graduate from school and enter university or the workforce, Masha carried with her the complicated legacy of Soviet childhood, the securities and the constraints, the belonging and the conformity, the education and the indoctrination, the genuine achievements and the hollow performances. She had learned to read and calculate and understand the physical world through science that was genuinely sophisticated. She had also learned to distrust official narratives and to recognize propaganda and to protect her thoughts from surveillance that extended even into children's organizations that claimed to serve their development, but that also evaluated their political reliability. The red neckerchief she had worn with pride at 9 she now wore with automatic habit at 17, putting it on each morning without thinking about what it symbolized. The performance so naturalized it no longer registered as performance. The conformity so routine it required no conscious effort. This was perhaps the system's greatest achievement and its deepest failure, that it could make children perform belief so thoroughly that the performance became invisible to those performing it, but that it could not make the performance into genuine belief, could not close the gap between what was required and what was felt, could not transform external conformity into internal conviction, no matter how early it started or how persistently it continued. And so Masha entered adulthood carrying within her the contradictions she had inherited, the divided consciousness that was the defining feature of Soviet life, the ability to be two people simultaneously, the public person who participated appropriately in official institutions, and the private person who maintained distance and doubt, and the small freedoms that made the participation bearable. She would join the party eventually, because career advancement required it. She would attend political meetings and repeat propaganda and perform her role as a good Soviet citizen. But she would also maintain her inner life, her private thoughts, her awareness that the system was not what it claimed, and that her participation was strategic rather than sincere. This was the inheritance of Soviet childhood, neither the new Soviet person that ideology promised to create, nor the broken victim that Western propaganda suggested, but something more ordinary and more resilient, a human being who had learned to survive in a system that claimed total authority, while finding ways to preserve the parts of herself that the system could not quite reach, that remained hers despite everything that had been done to claim them for the collective. The night deepens over these memories of childhood under ideology, over these complicated inheritances of belonging and constraint, of education and indoctrination, of genuine achievement and hollow performance. And we prepare for the final chapter, for the exploration of what remained private in a system that claimed everything should be public, for the inner lives that persisted despite attempts to eliminate them, for the slow unraveling that would eventually reveal that surfaces of conformity concealed depths of doubt, that ideology could influence but never completely control. The samizdat pages were thin, almost translucent, passed from hand to hand in a chain of trust that extended across Moscow and beyond, typewritten copies of forbidden texts that circulated in the shadows of official culture like a second, invisible literature existing parallel to what filled bookstore shelves and library collections. Anna Borisovna received her copy from a colleague at the institute where she worked as a translator, the handoff casual enough to avoid drawing attention. The manuscript slipped into her bag during a coffee break, to be read at home behind closed doors and passed on to the next trusted reader within a week. The text was Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, the massive documentation of Stalin's camp system that could not be published in the Soviet Union, but that everyone knew existed, that circulated despite the danger because people needed to know what had been done in socialism's name, needed to confront the gap between ideology's promises and history's reality, needed to understand that the terror that had defined their parents' generation had been real and systematic and had never been properly acknowledged or atoned for. Anna read it over 3 nights, sitting in her kitchen while her family slept, absorbing testimony that confirmed what she had suspected but never seen documented. That the system she lived within had been built on foundations of mass murder and forced labor, that millions had died in camps for crimes they had not committed, that the revolution had consumed its own children with methodical brutality. Reading Samaizdat was technically illegal, distribution of anti-Soviet materials punishable by years in camps. Though enforcement had become selective in the Brezhnev era, the state preferring to ignore most private reading while cracking down on public distribution, on those who printed or organized the networks, rather than on ordinary citizens who simply read what was passed to them. But the act still carried risk, required trust in the person who had given you the pages and trust that you would give them only to someone equally trustworthy, that the chain would not be broken by someone who reported to authorities out of conviction or fear or the desire to gain favor. This underground culture existed in the spaces between official control, in the private apartments where conversations happened that could not happen publicly, in the kitchens where friends gathered late at night to speak honestly about frustrations and doubts that had to remain hidden during the day, in the moments when the public performance could be set aside and people could simply be themselves without calculation or fear. These spaces were precious and fragile, protected by silence and discretion, by the understanding that what was said here stayed here, that the division between public and private selves had to be maintained absolutely or both would be destroyed. Anna's apartment had become one of these spaces, a gathering place for a small circle of friends who had known each other since university, who had maintained their friendships through decades while watching each other navigate the system's demands, who could speak openly because they had learned each other's boundaries and limits, who had earned the trust that made genuine conversation possible. They met irregularly whenever someone had something to share, forbidden books or Western music smuggled through contacts, or simply the need for company that did not require performance for relationships that could acknowledge the gap between official reality and lived experience without judgment or danger. These gatherings were not political in the sense of planning resistance or organizing opposition. They were simply spaces where people could be honest, where they could admit that the propaganda was propaganda, that the shortages were real, that the system was failing to deliver on promises that had been made for decades. The honesty itself was radical in a context where public honesty was dangerous, where acknowledging obvious truths could mark you as unreliable, where maintaining the fiction that everything was fine was mandatory, even when everyone knew it was not. But beneath these private conversations was a question that gnawed at everyone who participated. What did you do with your knowledge? If you understood that the system was dysfunctional, that the ideology was hollow, that the promises would never be fulfilled, how did you live with that understanding while continuing to participate in the system? to work in its institutions, to raise children within its frameworks? The answer for most was compartmentalization, the division of self into public and private personas, the performance of conformity while preserving doubt, the strategic participation that allowed you to function without being consumed. Anna's work as a translator gave her unusual access to foreign texts, to Western literature and journalism that most Soviet citizens never encountered, and this access created its own burdens. She could see how the world beyond Soviet borders was described in official media versus how it actually functioned based on what she read, could recognize the distortions and omissions that shaped Soviet understanding of the outside world, could measure the gap between the claimed superiority of socialism and the actual living standards and freedoms that capitalist nations provided to their citizens. This knowledge was isolating because sharing it too widely was dangerous, because it marked you as someone with access that implied privilege and therefore potential unreliability. The 1970s wore on with a particular quality of stagnation, the Brezhnev era settling into patterns that would persist for years. The economy functioning adequately to prevent crisis but inadequately to provide comfort. The ideology repeated ritualistically but with decreasing conviction. The society existing in a kind of suspended animation where nothing seemed to change, but the sense of possibility kept narrowing. Anna watched her children grow up in this environment, absorbing the same double consciousness she had developed, learning to navigate the same contradictions, except that for them the system had never been anything but stagnant, had never inspired the hope that her parents' generation had felt before Stalin's terror destroyed it. Her daughter, Katya, was cynical in ways that Anna's generation had not been, skeptical not just about Soviet propaganda but about the entire project, uninterested in the debates between reform and revolution that had animated previous generations, because she simply wanted access to the consumer goods and cultural products that the West had and that the Soviet system could not provide. Katya collected Western fashion magazines acquired through black market channels, learned English from illegal radio broadcasts, dreamed of travel to places she would never be allowed to visit because travel outside socialist bloc countries was restricted to those with proven political reliability, and even then was granted sparingly. This generational shift was happening everywhere, the erosion of belief proceeding not through dramatic rejection, but through quiet indifference, through the growing recognition that the system had failed to deliver what it had promised and showed no signs of being able to deliver it in any foreseeable future. The younger generation did not rebel openly because open rebellion was still too costly, but they withdrew into private pursuits, into the small freedoms of unofficial culture, into the spaces where the system's control was weakest and individual choice was still possible. Then came 1985 and Mikhail Gorbachev, a new general secretary who was younger than his predecessors and who spoke differently about the system's problems, who acknowledged that stagnation was real and that change was necessary, who introduced policies called glasnost, and perestroika that promised openness and restructuring. The promises were greeted with cautious hope by some and cynical dismissal by others. The familiar dynamic of Soviet reform, where leaders promised transformation while the system resisted all fundamental change, where rhetoric exceeded reality and disappointment followed inevitably. But this time was different. Glasnost opened spaces for public discussion that had been closed for decades. Newspapers began publishing critiques of Stalin that would have been impossible years before. Television showed problems that official media had previously ignored, and the carefully constructed facade of Soviet success began cracking as the system's failures were acknowledged publicly rather than whispered privately. Anna watched this unfold with a mixture of exhilaration and dread, excited by the possibility of genuine change while fearing that the opening would be temporary, that the controls would reimpose themselves once the leadership decided that criticism had gone too far. The changes accelerated faster than anyone anticipated. By 1989, the satellite states in Eastern Europe were breaking free, the Berlin Wall falling in November in images that flashed around the world. The Soviet Empire that had seemed permanent suddenly revealing its fragility, held together not by genuine allegiance but by force and fear that were proving insufficient when populations decided they wanted something different. Anna watched the news with her family, seeing crowds celebrating in Berlin and Prague and Warsaw, feeling complicated emotions because the collapse of Soviet control meant vindication of everything she had doubted about the system, but also uncertainty about what would replace it. In the Soviet Union itself, the unraveling was slower but equally inexorable. The economy, already dysfunctional, began collapsing completely as the old structures broke down and new ones failed to emerge, as the planning system lost whatever effectiveness it had retained, and market mechanisms were introduced without the institutions needed to make them function. Shortages that had been chronic became acute. Stores were empty, not just of luxury items but of basics. And the informal networks that had supplemented official distribution systems were overwhelmed by the scale of dysfunction. Anna stood in queues that grew longer each month, watching the Soviet Union fall apart, not through dramatic collapse, but through slow dissolution, through the accumulation of small failures that added up to systemic breakdown, through the recognition that was spreading across the population that the system could not reform itself, that 70 years of the experiment were ending, not in the triumph that had been promised, but in the acknowledgement that the promises could not be kept, that the vision had been flawed from the beginning or had been corrupted beyond repair, or perhaps both. The attempted coup in August 1991 was the final spasm, hardliners trying to reimpose the old order, to reverse the changes that were destroying the system they had built their lives around. Anna watched Boris Yeltsin stand on a tank defending the Russian parliament, watched crowds gather to protect the symbols of reform, watched the coup collapse within days because the instruments of repression no longer had the will or the credibility to enforce the old order against populations that had stopped believing in it. And then it was over. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, dissolved by agreement of the republics, that had been held together by force and ideology and the weight of history, now choosing independence over unity, uncertain futures over the failed present. Anna watched the red flag come down over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor, the symbolic end of a state that had defined her entire life, that had shaped everything from her education to her career to the way she thought about politics and society and human possibility. The emotions were impossibly complex. Relief that the system's hypocrisies and controls were ending, that she might not have to perform belief in ideology she had stopped believing in decades before. Fear about what came next, about whether the new Russia would be better or just different, about whether the promised democracy and markets would deliver prosperity or chaos, loss for what was being discarded along with the dysfunction, the securities that the system had provided, however inadequately, the free education and health care and housing that capitalism might not guarantee, the sense of common purpose that ideology had created, even when that purpose was never quite achieved. Anna's mother, who had lived through revolution and civil war and collectivization and Stalin's terror and World War II and the long stagnation of the Brezhnev years, watched the collapse with something close to despair. She had suffered under the system, but had also believed in it once, had thought that the suffering was building something worthwhile, that the future would justify the costs of the present. Now the future had arrived, and it looked like capitulation rather than triumph, like the admission that it had all been for nothing, that the millions who had died and the generations who had sacrificed had done so not for a noble cause, but for a failed experiment that was being abandoned. The years that followed were chaotic and painful, the 1990s bringing economic collapse that made Soviet shortages seem almost manageable by comparison, hyperinflation destroying savings, privatization transferring state assets to oligarchs who became wealthy while ordinary citizens became poor, the promised prosperity of capitalism revealing itself as another set of false promises that benefited some while leaving most struggling to survive in conditions that felt in some ways worse than what they had endured under socialism. Anna found work difficult in the new economy. Her skills as a translator were valuable, but her age made employment precarious in systems that now valued youth and connections to new power structures over the experience and education that had mattered under the old system. She watched her daughter adapt more successfully, Katya's cynicism about Soviet ideology translating into entrepreneurial flexibility, her desire for Western goods becoming a business opportunity in the new Russia, where anything could be bought if you had money and everything was for sale, including things that should not have been. But beneath the economic chaos and political uncertainty, there was also something that had not existed before: the possibility of genuine choice, of speaking openly without calculating political costs, of criticizing leaders without fearing arrest, of traveling or reading or believing whatever you wanted without the state's permission. These freedoms were new and precious and confusing, the absence of control feeling sometimes like liberation and sometimes like abandonment. The state that had claimed to provide everything, now providing almost nothing, leaving individuals to navigate systems that had no interest in their welfare and no obligation to guarantee their security. Looking back across the 70 years that had passed between revolution and collapse, Anna tried to make sense of what it had all meant, what lessons could be extracted from the extraordinary experiment in remaking human society that had consumed 3 generations and touched hundreds of millions of lives. The system had achieved things that could not be dismissed, had transformed an agrarian empire into an industrial superpower, had provided education and health care and housing to populations that capitalism had left illiterate and sick and homeless, had defeated fascism at costs that Western nations had not had to pay, had demonstrated that alternatives to capitalism were at least possible, even if this particular alternative had ultimately failed. But the costs had been staggering, not just the deaths from famine and terror and war, but the spiritual costs of living divided selves, of performing belief you did not feel, of maintaining appearances while protecting thoughts that had to remain private, of raising children in systems that tried to claim them entirely while trying to preserve their capacity for independent judgment, of spending your entire life navigating between the official and the actual, the propaganda and the reality, the promises and the experiences that bore no relation to what had been promised. And perhaps the deepest failure was not economic or political, but human. The failure to create the new Soviet person who would transcend selfishness and individualism, who would find fulfillment in collective achievement rather than personal gain, who would internalize the ideology so completely that external controls would become unnecessary. That person never emerged. Human nature proved more stubborn than Marxist theory had anticipated, because people kept wanting things that socialism declared were bourgeois corruptions. After all, the gap between individual desires and collective demands could not be closed through propaganda or pressure or even through generations of socialization. As the night deepens over these reflections, we are left with the understanding that the Soviet experiment taught us as much through its failures as other systems teach through their successes. That the attempt to build heaven on earth revealed something about the dangers of utopian thinking and the costs of subordinating individuals to grand historical projects. That the promise of scientific socialism ran aground on the complexity of human motivation and the unpredictability of social development, that the vision of a world without exploitation created its own forms of oppression that were in some ways more total than what it had promised to replace. But we also see the resilience of people who lived through this experiment, who found ways to preserve their humanity despite systems designed to remake them entirely, who maintained relationships and created meaning and raised children and built lives that were ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, who survived not just physically, but spiritually, keeping alive the parts of themselves that ideology could not quite reach, that remained stubbornly individual, even in a collective that claimed to have eliminated individualism. The Soviet Union is gone now, relegated to history, its monuments crumbling, its ideology discredited, and its promises unfulfilled. But the people who lived through it carry forward complicated inheritances, memories of both achievement and oppression, both security and constraint, both belonging and conformity. They learn to live in contradiction, to maintain multiple truths simultaneously, to function in systems they doubted while preserving dignity in circumstances that did not always honor it. And this, perhaps, is what we carry forward from those 70 years. Not the ideology or the politics, but the human lesson about adaptation and endurance, about the capacity to survive in conditions that should have broken you, about finding meaning in spaces that claim to have assigned all meaning, about remaining yourself when everything around you insists you should become someone else. Sleep now, carrying these stories of daily life under a system that promised everything and delivered something far more complicated, that transformed society while failing to transform human nature, that collapsed under its own contradictions while leaving behind questions about how we organize collective life, about the balance between individual freedom and social security, about what we owe each other and what we owe ourselves, about the eternal tension between the world as it is and the world as we believe it could be. Rest well. The experiment ended, but the questions it raised remain, asking us still what kind of society we want to build, what costs we are willing to pay for our ideas, whether the promises we make can ever match the realities we deliver, whether human beings can ever be fully remade, or whether we must accept them as they are, contradictory and complicated and stubbornly individual, despite all systems that would make us otherwise. Tomorrow comes with its own challenges. But tonight we remember those who navigated different challenges, who got up each morning in the Soviet Union and made it through another day, who queued for bread and worked in factories and raised children and maintained inner lives that ideology could not capture, who survived 70 years of extraordinary history through the ordinary heroism of simply continuing, of adapting without being destroyed, of preserving something human in conditions designed to eliminate everything except what served the collective purpose. The stories are told, the system has passed into history, but the people remain, carrying forward what they learned, what they lost, what they preserved through decades of living between public performance and private truth, between the ideology that claimed them and the selves that remained somehow indestructibly their own. If this journey through Soviet daily life has helped you understand the gap between ideology and experience, between what systems promise and what people actually live, consider sharing these reflections with others who seek to understand history not through grand narratives but through the texture of ordinary hours. And tell us, in the quiet space below, which other daily lives, which other ordinary experiences in extraordinary circumstances you would like us to explore together in the nights ahead.